Alright, YouTube, I thought I'd weigh in a little bit on this subject here that they're talking about all over the news about this Christian pastor in Iran who's been sentenced to death for, basically proselytizing Christianity. And this issue splits me two different ways because on the one hand, I, as a libertarian anyway, I don't believe that any state should have the right to execute anyone within the state. Regardless of what they've done. I don't agree with military tribunals. I don't agree with the death sentence in any case. It doesn't matter if a person murders 1,000 other people, what does it prove by killing them? For one thing, when you put someone on death row, at least in Western countries, that is, they get, higher grade prison facilities. It actually costs more to have them on death row for a couple decades, which is how long they're usually there, than it would just to put them in a maximum security prison for the rest of their life. So really it just takes a lot of money, and it gives the state undue power. I mean, you can always, let's face it, the government has the means at its disposal to botch a case and put someone in prison on death row without any real evidence. The state does have the ability to do that, and I think it's potentially abused. And at the other side of it, I can understand where the Iranians are coming from, because this is a Muslim nation, and Islam is a very strict fundamentalist doctrine. Now, I personally don't give a shit about Islam. I don't support Islam. I think it's a backwards-ass, crazed desert cult, just like Christianity is. It's kind of interesting, though, to see the way the media portrays this case. They're up in arms about this wonderful Christian pastor who's just trying to bring the heathens to the glory of Jesus Christ. Oh, he's going to be executed by the Iranians, those terrible, terrible Iranians. And yet, the media community at large continuously ignores stories where in Christian countries, in Africa, gays are being killed, lesbians are being killed, Wiccans are being killed, Satanists are being killed, atheists are being killed, Muslims are being killed, Hindus are being killed, all of these various groups. See, here's the problem. The reason, and I have said this before, that Islam in many of these countries in the Middle East, the reason why Islam is violent in these countries isn't because of a specific Muslim doctrine. It's because these countries, economically, while they have a lot of oil to export, and there are quite a few people in these countries that are quite rich, the vast majority of the populations in these countries are not rich. They're still relatively poor. The reason they're relatively uneducated, these countries don't tend to have, other than Saudi Arabia certainly, more than a rudimentary educational system set up. They're still using old military technology. Their economy is in shambles because the problem is this. They're following an economic system whereby a small proportion of the population inherits a great deal of the wealth. They own all the means of production and so forth. And the vast majority of the population suffers because they don't have any access to such things. There's no real way for them to get ahead. A lot of these people farm for a living. They own the same 10-acre family farm they've owned since the Middle Ages. That's the problem with the economy. So the reason why the religion is so fundamentalist in a lot of these countries isn't because of any particular religious doctrine, and this is the same with Christianity as well. If you look at third world Christianity versus westernized style Christianity as it's practiced in, for instance, most of the United States, most of Europe, the difference is that in a third world country where it's racked by poverty, people tend to be more superstitious, more fundamentalist. They tend to be more violent about their religion. They cling to it much more ferociously because in the Western world, there's a protection for people who leave a religion. There's protection for people who don't believe in that religion to begin with. There's less religiosity in general because when someone lives in a first world country, they see the prosperity around them. They don't feel compelled to beg God for their next meal. In some of these countries, such as parts of Iran, although Iran is actually doing relatively well for the most part economically, there's still obviously a lot of poverty. And you see this throughout the Middle East. But like I pointed out, look at African Christianity. You can look at videos on YouTube even. The African Christian movement is extraordinarily fundamentalist, extraordinarily violent, and by and large the Western Christian-run media completely ignores the abuse of non-believers in the African Christian churches. They are still burning witches in Africa. They are still stoning gays. They are still destroying people with mental illnesses and labeling them possessed or witches or so forth. They're still abusing the lesbian and gay communities heavily. They're still abusing the atheists. There's widespread discrimination against all of these groups, and nobody in the Western media bats an eye, because the Western media is completely run by idiots like Rupert Murdoch and so forth. These are people who have ties. They're either Christian themselves, or they have a reason to play to the Christian community for more viewers for their news networks. So here in the United States in particular, you don't hear about the cases in Africa or parts of Asia where Christians are beating on non-believers. All you hear about is these horrible Muslims. Like I said, I don't support Islam. I have no love for Islam. I think it's shit. But I think the same thing about Christianity when it's being practiced in this superstitious Iron Age sense where they're still burning witches on a constant basis. It's happened. And there are certain media outlets that have covered it. BBC, I believe, did a good story on, it was called, like, Africa's Witch Children. I think it was BBC. That literally these children with mental illnesses and so forth are being called witches, or the product of witches, and people are burned at the stake, stoned, drowned, all the things you would find out of the Salem witch trials. Nobody says a thing. But one pastor in Iran is going to get executed because he's proselytizing Christianity, and suddenly he's a martyr, and he's a hero, and these horrible Iranians that are always trying to develop nuclear weapons and do all the other things that the United States does, aka bully around the nations in close proximity, which it potentially has a military prowess over, these people suddenly are dirt-worshipping heathen terrorists. I don't see it that way. I look at the Iranians and I see them trying to basically emulate the United States. Now, isn't that odd to think that this nation that we've been taught for the last 10 or so years, since all this anti-Islamic stuff came up, we look at them as terrorists and we say, oh, well, they dare defy us. They're trying to close off the Strait of Hormuz, and they're trying to oppress the Christians, and they're trying to, do all these terrible, terrible things. They're trying to spread foreign policy into Afghanistan, and into, they're trying to influence the Syrians and give the government their support. I don't look at these Middle Eastern regimes as legitimate. I think they're a bunch of tyrants and assholes. But really, they're no different than a slightly more fundamentalist version of the United States. Really, Iran is just doing the same thing that the United States does, only on a lesser basis, because, number one, again, they don't have nuclear weapons, at least yet. Number two, their military pretty much sucks, and they're only a regional power at best. So while they may be able to bully, they could probably roll into Syria and take Syria over in a week if they wanted to. They can't do anything against us. And yet we're worried about them getting, a handful of nuclear weapons or even, enriched uranium. The Israelis are constantly up in arms, despite the fact that Israel most likely has dozens or hundreds of nuclear weapons and a first world military and educational system and a first world economy. You look at the way the Middle East operates, it's just totally fucked up. But I find it hilarious that this one pastor in Iran who might get sentenced to death is a martyr and a hero. But all of the gay people and atheists and Satanists and so forth all over Africa, well, they're just scum, ignore them. It really is a biased double standard in the Western media to portray stories this way when they completely ignore millions and millions of people who are being abused all over Africa, but they constantly focus on everything that Iran does, everything that Syria does, and they say, well, those are abusive terrorists, but these Christians in Africa who burn gays at the stake, they're wonderful people. We're spreading the joy of Jesus into Africa. We're taming those black heathens. It's wonderful. And that's really the way that the overwhelmingly white Christian church views it anyway. Oh, well, these monstrous animist black people and these Muslims in these black communities, they're subhuman apes. We've got to teach them Jesus. It's the same sort of thing that they were talking about when they first encountered the black populations in the first place, and then tied them under colonialism. Oh, well, we'll give them Jesus, and they'll shuffle their feet happily and eat watermelon all day, and they'll talk about Jesus. We've got to get them away from this Islam nonsense, even though Islam is an adapted form of Christianity. So it's really hilarious to me, because on the one hand, I can hate Islam. On the other hand, I can also hate Christianity and chastise the Western media for completely ignoring the abuses by Christians of these groups. And then there's like this crazed fundamentalist running around Africa right now, converting tens of thousands of people to, I guess I don't know whether he's a Protestant or a Catholic, to tell the truth. I can't remember his name, but he's some big-time evangelical that's spreading the joy of Christianity to all these black people. And it's like, well, what's the point? All you're doing is giving them a reason to burn gays at the stake. It's absolutely ridiculous, to tell the truth. And the Western media just eats it up and says, oh, well, what a touching story about those million people who accepted Jesus that day. Never mind that hundreds of black people were in the back row. I mean, hundreds of gay people were outside the stadium being crucified for being sodomites. So that's okay, because we'd like to do that in the United States too. The only thing preventing that is that we actually have a judicial system which protects gay people a little. Won't let them marry, but at least we don't burn them at the stake. The Western media is just completely fucked up. And personally, I couldn't care less whether they crucify this pastor in Iran upside down. I couldn't care whether every Iranian gets crucified upside down. I would think it would be funny. But really, when you look at the way the media operates, it's just fucked up. Peace out.